Three, two, one, and we are live. Good afternoon or good morning, as it were. This is Joaquin Flores. We are doing a very limited stream here, only inside the Center for Syncretic Studies group on Facebook. We are going to utilize the opponent's tools, engage in a mild guerrilla struggle here and again, so long as we can get away with it. Now, my own personal exit from Facebook has meant that I am no longer going to be posting new content on my Facebook wall. So with that said, we should make it clear that the repression that we have faced, Fort Roos News and the Center for Syncretic Studies, has been tremendous. There has been an ongoing campaign, an ongoing decision by the authorities to suppress what we are doing, because it is, I think, in their eyes, a problem. Now, why it's a problem, of course, well, we are connecting things and people and ideas that traditionally aren't supposed to be connected and done this way, because we are, with honest intentions, looking to transcend a lot of the problems that are going to be inherent in the present paradigm. But we live in a time of tremendous change, and that paradigm is shifting. And for these reasons, what we have done, I think, has rattled a lot of cages. As we have explained to our readers on Fort Roos News, there's been numerous attempts by foreign intelligence agencies to infiltrate us. We won't name those countries or that country, but we know that this is a country that wields tremendous power disproportionate to its size. And the penetration of our media sphere has been repeated, and it has been more than apparent. And we're talking beyond algorithmic shadow banning and the normal sort of things that we're seeing. We're talking about human tell attempts to infiltrate individuals, physical agents, threats, smear campaigns. That is a tremendous problem. I'm being told that we have an echo, but I'm going to need you to let me know if it continues to echo as I make an adjustment. I don't know why we would have an echo per se. Can you let me know if we still have an echo? Anyway, so what we are doing now is showing some of our real work and discussing the ideas that are changing the paradigm. And the reason that we have to do this is, in these conditions where we find ourselves under repeated attack, the only way forward, the only method that's going to work, is not to go into hiding, but to push back. And time is on our side, and the truth is on our side. And that's why the things that we do go viral. I can't explain it enough, what we've been through, and I don't want to belabor the point. Of course, we want to protect the privacy of our friends and those who have worked with us, so we won't get into details because it involves a lot of us. But it's a very big problem, and it's one that we should be aware of. It goes far beyond simply what we understand the normal repression of this time to consist of in the conventional sense. So without further ado, what we're going to be doing is doing a reading of this and a discussion. So this is for people who read and follow our work and understand the nature of the project itself. And I think and I hope through this, if you haven't come to learn the nature of the work of the project itself, that you will. So this is Jafe's most recent entry in the series, The Multipolar Revolution. And these are really this is really a great characterization of the time that we live in. I think it goes beyond this as well. So let's take where we're at with this and continue. So it reads, of the three main socio-political ideologies of modernity, liberalism, Marxism, and fascism and their offshoots. Marxism is arguably the most complex, scientific, and paradoxical. On the one hand, the theories of Karl Marx are no less contextually rooted in their 19th century Western European environment than other thinkers and currents that contributed to the first and third political ideologies. On the other hand, Marxism proved to be something more historically commanding and globally relevant than the myriad of other 19th century frameworks and theories which proposed a socio-political trajectory of modernity based on one or another meta-historical philosophical narrative. Societies claiming to be consciously guided by Marxist ideology and realizing its political pivot, the dictatorship of the proletariat, once covered nearly half of the globe for half of the most turbulent of the 20th century, thereby shaping a unique experience of modernity for more than 1 billion people, and rather convincingly insisting that communism would be the end of history. In this installment, we will address the dilemma of Marxism from two standpoints. One, weighing the benefits, downsides, and paradoxes of Marx's framework, and two, demonstrating the relevance of Marxism's identification of relations of production and class to understanding the mythological, sociological, and political economic developmental trends that uniquely affected primordial Indo-European society. With these analyses integrated into our arsenal, we can move ever closer to understanding the modernity that we are leaving, how it came about, and the multipolar world into which we are moving. In order to broach such, we must first establish why it is worth picking Marx up again at all. If we analyze Marx's corpus as a whole, from the 1840s to his posthumous publication by Engels in the 1880s and 90s, we can discern a tripartite thematic thread. Now, I think this is a very interesting point in which we can stop for a moment to discuss some of the points that are being raised here, because now we're going to be looking at a reflection of his critical texts. Now, I would add to this so far, what we've said. I would add to that of the three political theories which all existed simultaneously in the 20th century, Marxism is probably the least understood by its own adherents. And that is something which is probably unique in many ways to the second political theory. But when we sort of zoom out and look from a bird's eye view at those who call themselves liberals, there are many important things, many important aspects of liberalism that were so fundamentally important and contributed so greatly to the human experience. Now, when we use these words like liberalism, Marxism, fascism, we have to be able to use them as neutrally as possible. Of course, we can't escape the subjectivity, but what we're trying to build is a higher degree of intersubjectivity so that we can speak the same language and understand each other. So in many ways, I think that we could add to that within fascism, there are many people many adherents who do not understand exactly what it is, because they are subscribing to an element of it which was designed to have people subscribe to those elements for certain reasons connected to the irrational. And however, with Marxism, it is what we have is a very interesting system in which the human psychological motives that build into the movement itself are more or less unexamined by the traditional texts within Marxism. So it's not as self-analytic. It's not looking at the practices and beliefs and motivations of practitioners of Marxism. And so that lack of self-reflection is proved problematic in the development, because it has led to the development of various discourses in Marxism that lack this very important component of self-reflection and self-criticism, in which the psychology of movement itself is not analyzed. So to carry forward with Jafe's piece here, he writes, we have one, Marx's philosophical writings in which he arrived at his dialectical materialist understanding of history. Two, his transition of such into socio-political equations, which culminated in the 1848 Communist Manifesto, the 1850s narratives on class struggles in France, and in 1871 with the Civil War in France. And we have three, Marx's economic dissection of the capitalist mode and relations of production enshrined in his economic manuscripts, pamphlets, and of course, Capital, which preoccupied him from the late 1850s until his death in 1883. These texts were used as Bibles, blueprints, and laws by more than a few states in the 20th century. Now, several decades after the end of the bipolar capitalist socialist world, and amidst the collapse of the unipolar liberal world and rising multipolarity today, we have sufficient grounds and necessity for re-examining what is veritable and what is problematic in Marx from beyond the confines of modernity. Our rereading of Marx naturally will be attempted in the context of the archaeofuturistic paradigm of onsetting multipolarity, the rediscovery and imperative addressing of the Indo-European heritage of much of the space on the Eurasian continent, and in light of the relevance of geopolitics. To think about this section for a moment, I think that we can understand that there has been in a lot of global discourse, anti-colonial, post-colonial, global South discourse, there has been an accusation that there is an inherent Eurocentrism within Marxism. And in many ways, that may be seen in the practice of Marxism, that may be seen as a valid criticism. Now, that doesn't mean that the tools that are developed therein, or the doors that it opened to understanding and developing the school of scientific socialism, are not relevant. And certainly, the tools that are developed can be applied to people all over the world. They can be used in various movements. It's just a tool. So Marxism itself has a certain framework, and there's different components of Marxism, but there are many aspects of Marxism which, as analytic tools, can really be used by any people, and can use science of sociology in any number of directions to develop that society. And I don't think that that necessarily comes to be something which is at odds with the light determinism inherent in Marxism. And I don't think that it requires, or necessitates rather, a criticism of the light determinism inherent in Marxism. But it's really not so much a question that every part of the world is going to develop the same way and according to the same foundations, but rather that the system of analysis and the methodological approach is universal. So you might, for example, use a certain methodological approach to do a sort of global taxonomy of the various plants and vegetation of the world, but that doesn't mean that the plants and vegetation of the world are the same. It just means that you have a universal set of tools which can be used to analyze them, but it can still understand that they're going to be developing differently. And so that's what I mean by separating Marxism as an analytic framework from the religion or the modern contemporary secular religion of communism. So we can move forward then. These texts were used as Bibles, blueprints, and laws by more than a few states in the 20th century. Now, several decades after the end of the bipolar capitalist socialist world and amidst the collapse of the unipolar liberal world and rising multipolarity, we have sufficient grounds and necessity for re-examining what is veritable and what is problematic in Marx from beyond the confines of modernity. Yes, we were here. So we skip forward from here because we understood this part about the context of archaeofuturistic paradigm. In the above-mentioned tripartite corpus, Marx accomplished three major points. First of all, Marx demonstrated that the logic of modern philosophy's gravitation towards materialism can itself be explained in terms of material processes. Hence, Marx's proposal to turn forerunning philosophical trends on their head, i.e., towards a materialist understanding of historical processes and the formation of the concrete social basis for philosophy and ideology. That materialist modernity has decisive roots in material processes, which Marx identified as the historical trajectory of modes and relations of production, was a revolutionary thesis which was, rightly or wrongly, advertised as demythologizing or demystifying the spiritual narratives of modernity, such as Hegel's. It was Marx who laid bare the raw material relations of modernity and capitalism, traced the latter's emergence in Western Europe, and pointed towards the world historic repercussions of capitalism to the globe, especially the billions of toilers who create material value. In so doing, Marx exposed modernity for the myth that it is, as a product of, by, and for the relations of production and class relations which express themselves ideologically. Even if he considered such to be natural, historically progressive, Marx recognized that modernity is indeed a product or force of alienation expressed in socioeconomic processes. Quote, in history, up to the present, it is certainly an empirical fact that separate individuals have, with the broadening of their activity into world historical activity, become more and more enslaved under a power alien to them, a pressure which they have conceived of as a dirty trick on the part of so-called universal spirit, etc., a power which has become more and more enormous and, in the last instance, turns out to be the world market. In turn, Marx argued that this alienation must be abolished or negated, in part by demystifying the concrete socioeconomic relations of this modernity's world market. Secondly, to this end, Marx qualitatively systematized modern political economic thought on these material processes into a scientific framework of analysis. The resulting Marxian science, dealing with equations of modes, means, and relations to production, class contradictions, capital and production cycles, technological tendencies, etc., have been revised, ideologically instrumentalized, or moralized by different political forces, but it has not been refuted on its own grounds, much less has it been surpassed as a compendium of political economic thought. The potency of Marx's framework for analyzing capitalism and its accompanying historical processes might be dogmatized, misapplied, or instrumentalized by different ideological projects, but the trends and equations of capital he discerned have not been disproven. On the contrary, they have proven so useful that bourgeois economists themselves have turned to Marx for answers in understanding the cycles of capitalism and global trends. Hence, also, Marx's appropriation by establishments, schools of thought, and movements which are otherwise plainly non-Marxist. Thirdly, Marx developed an alternative socio-political vision for modernity, positing its own unique trajectory of these material processes towards communism. Now, I think that we can add here that when we understand the sociopolitical vision for modernity, that through this unique trajectory, through these of material processes, that communism was really the end of, was something that would happen after modernity. So modernity is really synonymous. The thing is that in Marxist theory, modernity and capitalism are very much synonymous. So that's very interesting because that means that we have a very different reading of the concept of modernity than is applied outside of Marxism and in other circles. Because in other circles, there is a translational and conceptual difference. And outside of Marxism, modernity is something in which socialism, communism, fascism, and liberalism have all occurred, and all of which are ideologies of modernity. Now, what's interesting is that one can also take a very orthodox Marxist approach, even if it borders on disenfranchising or pessimistic, that really when you're talking about socialism and communism, communism as opposed to communist movements, communist parties in power of states that are nominally socialist, that communism is a postmodern realization of the expansion of the productive forces and development of human culture to a point that it is really the end of the history of the class struggle, of which we recall that all previous hitherto existing history had been, and that communism is after this negation of the negation, and the law of value that is based in economic scarcity is something which the socialist economy develops and which communism is built upon. And since scarcity is, for Marxists, in their anthropological optimism, that scarcity is the basis, is the removable foundation upon which human hierarchies are formed into state apparatuses, that as a result of the transcendence or negation of the law of value, which is overcoming economic scarcity, that the state itself withers away. So in communist ideology, a actual communist society is a future type of postmodern society that has not yet existed, and at least for a century or half a century was really connected to a shared vision that social anarchists or anarchists of the left had in terms of what their vision of a society would be. And the differences between communism and anarchism were a matter of what steps one takes to achieve that. Now, that bridging of socialism and anarchism has allowed movements like Antifa to arise, where some are more anarchist dominant and some are more communist dominant. But Antifa, of course, in Europe is a more communist force, in the United States a more anarchist force. But the history of anarchism and communism are tightly intertwined. And anarchists and communists made the first international. And then, of course, we know the second international, and then the third international created by Lenin. But in this first international, of course, you have both anarchists and communists. And so then when we look at how Marxists have seen themselves, it would be probably an error to say that communism envisioned a society of the future that was essentially modern or modernist or within modernity. But it would be correct to say that these movements have arisen from within modernity. So if we're going to be very stringent and orthodox, consistent Marxists on this point, as I previously mentioned at the risk of certain things, that everything that occurs within modernity, i.e. capitalism, that the global system of capitalism has not been transcended, and therefore the pressures upon countries that have broken out of at least a certain degree of imperialism, formal colonialism, and that they nominally have sovereign governments. It has been the governments which were stridently nationalist or stridently socialist that were able to increase their degree of self-determination for the peoples or people that were represented in that nation state. And they were able to, in that degree, maintain some amount of their own produced wealth. And so we're moving against this alienation. and but at the same time being economically less advanced or less developed from the pinnacle of Western capitalism, would not be in the position to surpass the West. Now, I'm not speaking, of course, of Russia and China, which, had they stayed allied during the Cold War, we would be living in a very different history today. But rather, we would look at more peripheral states that are somewhat isolated, whether states in Africa or Latin America or the Caribbean, such as Cuba, that broke out of, or we can say Vietnam, for example, that broke out of formal capitalism, former capitalist rule, formally. But when you analyze that the economy is structured around the reality of scarcity, then you're going to have the mode of production is going to be, in the final analysis, the determiner of the means of production are going to be the final determinant of how we might generally characterize the mode of production. And so when we look at this mode of production in that way, a term state capitalism has been used. The problem in understanding state capitalism as a theory in this context is that it was always divorced separately, in the way that the sectarian groups among the old communist left, when they splintered apart in a process that began about 100 years ago to this year, really over this question of state capitalism. And but the Soviet economists, the first ones anyway, and those who developed the NEP in the time of Lenin, understood that the mode of production could be state monopoly capitalism, that the class character of the state could be a worker state, and that by developing the means of production through sort of a continuation of primitive capital accumulation under the dictatorship of the proletariat, that socialism could be arrived at. But socialism is still a society in which has state apparatuses that are still visible, still act upon the public. And it seems that this is where much of the theory breaks down in people's lived experiences in the practice. There are Marxist explanations for the processes of why the Soviet Union degenerated, and there are various different Marxist ones. But certainly I think that anyone would agree that it's very difficult from the point of view of rigorous scholarship or even consistent logic to focus on internal processes of the Soviet Union when there was generally a Western-led Atlanticist economic blockade and military campaign that was both in hot wars, numerous hot wars, and a ongoing Cold War. And so in that context, of course, it's certainly understandable that dividing or separating the internal processes that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union from the geopolitical processes is always going to be a difficult task. But moving forward with our piece here from J.F. Arnold on the multipolar revolution series in the Indo-European Mode of Production, Marx's ideas on that, or rather taking Marx's ideas further to explain the Indo-European Mode of Production. This is to develop, in part, I think, that those who have some appreciation for post-colonial theory, or who have explored Marx through critical lens of seeing Marx as connected to Eurocentrism, may understand that Marx was describing the development of European history, chiefly as his field of study. It would take others who would study things like the Asiatic mode of production, for example. So if there is within Marxism acceptability to analyze the Asiatic mode of production, which I would urge everyone to look at, then ergo it is certainly reasonable to talk about the Indo-European or Indo-Aryan mode of production. And so moving forward with our piece, Mr. Jafe continues, this social political alternative was attempted to be installed in various forms and circumstances across much of the non-West, starting in Russia, Eurasia in 1917, and straggling along to this day in Cuba and several Asian countries, in the very neutral, at least nominally. Marx proposed that capitalism be replaced by socialism under the auspices of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which would in time wither away into a communist utopia. Now, this was understood from Marx's and Engels' reflections upon the reasons of the lessons of the Paris Commune. And the dictatorship of the proletariat is a concept drawn from, not from Lenin, but from the Paris Commune. Attempts at mimicking this utopian endeavor make up the greater part of the 20th century, with paradoxical repercussions which we just might be beginning to sense. For example, the fact that the former socialist countries of Europe are more conservative, religious, and ethno-sociologically conscious immediately begs the intriguing recognition that modern materialist atheistic Marxism rendered a paradoxical experience of modernity in these spaces, which engendered societies tangibly more ideologically and socially pre-modern than their Western liberal neighbors. But this is an investigation for another time. The above are, in my opinion, the three qualitative keys which distinguish Marxism. Jave continues. We can also highlight some of the crucial limitations of Marxism with regard to its modernity. It is no secret that Marx's materialist apperception and deconstruction of modernity led to an internalization of such as normative, and a reifying of this paradigm back onto history. His correct identifying of the materialism modernity came to entail an appreciation of such as progress, as truth by virtue of its material factuality. Thus, Marx's revelation of the logic of material relations was necessarily or unnecessarily taken to necessarily exclude the value of anything metaphysical in history. On the origins of the family private property and the state of 1884, Engels turned Marx's notes on modern anthropology into a crudely positivist narrative of human history which overshadowed any potential nuances it might have contained. If Adam Smith's invisible hand was still obscure and not entirely secular, then Marx's invisible hand was raw accumulation in all of its economic reductionism. While this might be analytically heuristic in certain cases, it can be justifiably criticized as a negation of the metaphysical, which indeed can render it intrinsically problematic when looking at pre-materialist and especially pre-class worldviews and societies. This is also one of the many points against Marxism validly voiced from the right. Another example is how Marx and Engels' historical materialist class analysis of the origins of such institutions as the family, clan, marriage, ethnos, and other pre-modern collective identities altogether were violently construed to indict such collective identities altogether because of their superficial perceived social manifestations under capitalism. Joaquin Flores has inquisitively posited that this materialism might have been a noble lie intended to save a Gnostic understanding of modernity and harness the potential for a mass movement behind which lurks an undiscovered esoteric Marx. By all means, there definitely was a popular element implied in Marx's otherwise erudite analysis. After all, Marxian political economic diagnosis does not require a priestly or intellectual caste, and one of the essential implications or aims of Marx's analyses would be the raising of popular class consciousness and class revolutions. Be that as it may, it is clear that Marx did commit to materialism as normative, and Engels and Marx's 20th century subscribers sealed precisely this seal. Lenin's 1908 Materialism and Imperial Criticism beat the dead horse, canonizing radical materialism as an ideological requirement for any Marxist political project. This was, of course, Lenin's, taken aside from J. Arnold's text. So in Lenin's 1908 Materialism and Imperial Criticism is a critical text, and in it is where Lenin goes to war with Bogdanov. And Bogdanov was a very prominent and important Bolshevik intellectual and thinker, and was involved in the Bolsheviks from the start, and was in fact older than Lenin. And Bogdanov was looking at the development of Mach, and Mach, as people know, from Mach speed. And Mach's concepts, for example, would go on to form Western science through Einstein and his concept of relativity. First, the theory of relativity, and then the general theory of relativity. And the general theory of relativity of Einstein was a development of Mach. Now, what's interesting is that Mach takes much framing from Berkeley. Now, Berkeley is very interesting because we can see the direct connection between Berkeley and Einstein. And this has gone in several different directions. And this is a whole subject unto itself that the center will have to commit some future time into deconstructing for the public. But in looking at Lenin's attacks on Bogdanov, what is clear is that Lenin has to attack Mach and then has to attack Berkeley. And Berkeley's empiricism is not like the empiricism that we have today, but it gives primacy to the sense perception so much that it in fact posits that it's the sense perceptions that create the world. And Berkeley just had a completely different, I would say, development or continuation of Gnostic conception of reality, that the mind is not where thoughts are generated. It's not where the person in the vessel of a body derives their thoughts, but that the brain is chiefly, besides that it governs, that internal to the brain is the governing of the physical processes of the body, the use of involuntary muscles, really also the base instincts of the reptilian part of the brain, the amygdala, and that of course affects the 4 Fs. And so when we look at the relationship between Lenin and Bogdanov, we see that where people on the right have said that this ultra materialism as a point of authority, as a point of shaping the entire conception of man's relationship to existence, allowed for numerous dehumanizing aspects of that occurred nominally and in the accusations from those on the right, under the dictatorship of the proletariat. So we confront that something else, though, that we should draw from this is that there was within early Bolshevism this very interesting trend of Bogdanov's conception of the development of scientific socialism, and that it ought to incorporate Mach, which Lenin correctly draws thereby means to incorporate Berkeley. And in incorporating Berkeley, we would then start to see a very different conception that our relationship to something determines our entire assessment of it. So that, in other words, it's entirely a subject-based conception of reality, and that the highest level of truth content, and I think this is in fact consistent with Hegel's view of intersubjectivity, that it requires man's social interaction with man in order to even have the conception of the individual. And that's only through development of man as humanity, as mankind, that the concept of the individual is possible. And when we look, however, at the way that this polemical fight ended, it resulted in Bogdanov's demotion in the party, in the Bolshevik party, and it definitely, as Mr. Arnold says, sealed the seal as far as Lenin's development of scientific socialism. As an organizing method, there are many things to learn from the Vanguard Party that are universally applicable, probably apply to any political party that wants to be successful. However, what we should do, in looking forward at J. Arnold's piece, is to keep this in mind, that even in the time of Lenin, there was this Bogdanov, and that Bogdanov ultimately was drawing on something influenced by Berkeley, and that by way of Mach also went on to then as a parallel development was influenced Einstein at the same time that it was influencing Bogdanov. And so we can continue. Lenin's 1908 Materialism and Imperial Criticism beat the dead horse, canonizing radical materialism as an ideological requirement for any Marxist political project. The consequential politics of this idea led to thousands of years of Chinese history being physically destroyed. I think that is a reference to how the Cultural Revolution was understood. However, at the same time, we shouldn't fool ourselves that there was over a century of very, very stringent British imperialism acting upon China. And before that, the interaction with the Dutch, and who introduced the Jesuits into China, who also destroyed thousands of years of Chinese history, maybe more so even than the Cultural Revolution. But the British Imperial Project, or that of the Catholic Church and the Jesuits, as a joint project to team up, despite their own contradictions and power struggle over Europe, was a joint project to destroy Chinese history. So much of Chinese history today, like official Russian history, was developed by the Catholic Church. In the case of Russia, with the work of Germany in the creation of the Russian Academy of Sciences, which is a German project, not a Russian one. Moving forward with J. Arnold's piece. What's more, Marx's material socioeconomic observations themselves were largely based on the experiences of only two Western countries, England and France, which, from a long-term historical standpoint, were anomalies, even within their own civilization. But he internalized their experiences, like modernity as a whole, as universal and normative. Marx bought the bluff that capitalism was only an historical deviation from what Syncretic calls Eurasian normality. In some interpretations, Marx even intended such a policy blueprint for German statecraft. In the 20th century, Marx's Western referential model would face the paradox of being appropriated by non-Western societies, which inevitably had to contribute their own ideological revisions to this dilemma in order to survive in their respective environments. Different superstructure versus base equations would yield Lenin, and the establishment of the Soviet Union had to justify a workers' revolution in a peasant state, and socialism in one country. China would yield Maoism and socialism with Chinese characteristics, or the market socialist model. Revolutions in colonial countries yielded the third worldist socialisms, etc. Finally, Marxism would ultimately be applied in alternative experiences of modernity, as in alternative socio-economic development models for colonial countries, hence the numerous third world socialisms. Alternative ideological justifications for liberal modernity, especially in academia and identity politics, or conveniently form alternative modern political shells for relatively archaic cultures, for example, Stalin-era USSR, Juche North Korea, Chinese socialism for characteristically Chinese ancient bureaucratic models, we would say taking from Confucianism, for example. These unique socialist experiences themselves can crucially inform us as to the paradoxes of Marxism's modernity. Despite these limitations, the relevance of Marxism remains that it, as the most robust political economic ideology of modernity, offers to explain how modernity itself came about as a result of material class processes, and therefore might offer some guidelines as to where modernity is going. In order to grasp this, however, we have to stake our position in the space and history of the Indo-European cultures, of whose modernity Marx became a penetratingly self-reflective part and parcel. Marx's postulation of the development of productive forces at the very basic common denominator, recognizes the variable of geographic environment. For Marx, geography was not a referential marker for investigation, but could also be enshrined in modes of production. This can be seen in Marx's critique of Feuerbach in his 1845 The German Ideology, in which he stressed the variation of historical development of the division of labor in terms of both nations and town and country. A geographical factor in history, no doubt a residual hearkening to Hegel's geographic impulse, indeed rears its head through the German ideology, but by the time of Capital, Marx had abandoned space altogether in favor of time. Granted, Marx frequently evoked differences between nations and at times linked national or civilizational factors to mode of production, such as the Asiatic mode of production. In his 19th century German intellectual context, this might have borne connotations of space, which we can no longer associate with such terms, but nevertheless, the progressive situation of Marx's analysis on the basis of his observations of 19th century Anglo-Saxon society internalized the concentration of time as superseding that of space. But as we have affirmed, contrary to the myth of modernity, space is a value, and it is not universal. There are different spaces, different civilizations, and the attempted universalist reign over time and space of the liberal capitalist market of modernity is on its way out. To make Marx relevant to understanding the Indo-European legacy, we must therefore free Marx's framework from its prejudices of progress and time and situate ourselves in the Proto-Indo-European space, in the prehistoric Pontic-Caspian steppe, in which such modern prejudices and concepts were unknown and antithetical to even later really existing Indo-European societies. It should be clear that one of the most crucial dimensions of Marx's major theoretical accomplishments was the deciphering of class as an essential factor in this history, especially in what would become the West, out of which arose modernity, its bourgeoisie and proletariat. Socioeconomic cum sociopolitical classes or functions were not Marx's preoccupation by accident. They were a distinguishing feature of Proto-Indo-European society on the map of human civilizations and were a crucial legacy of the Indo-Europeans' impact on the societies of a significant portion of Eurasia. The contradictions and dialectics between functions, castes, and later classes form significant content of many Indo-European mythological narratives, the sum of which has been attempted to be addressed by the traditional school. Hindu legends of the revolt of the Kshatriyas, the warrior caste, against the Brahmins, the priests, and their respective punishment were interpreted by René Guénon as the revolt of temporal power against spiritual power, representing a degradation of traditional values in history. Julius Evola offered an exegesis largely preferable to European pagan traditions in which the warriors of traditional society were themselves imbued with initiatic quality, which the priestly caste boasts only in a truncated or particular form whose hegemony is potentially corrupt. Therefore, the warriors are the true traditional ruling class, fusing action and contemplation. For both Guénon and Evola, modernity in the West is the product of a long process of the degradation of caste power and corresponding metaphysical positions, a process which can be grasped through traditional myths. Alexander Dugin has critiqued Evola's schema from the left, arguing that Evola's identification of the proletariat and more generally the people in modern society as the least desirable class, the final degradation of society, is based on a misreading of early Indo-European caste development and an unjustifiable denial of the folk as a retainer of traditions, a position which contradicted Evola's otherwise consistent denunciations of everything bourgeois. As is the case with many grand typological narratives, divergences of or conflicting interpretations are usually based largely on inflations or misrepresentations of context. Yet both Marx's materialism and the traditionalists' metaphysical narratives harbor discourses on class dynamics which can be useful in deciphering the historical trajectory of the Indo-Europeans. If we can recognize that the traditionalist narratives on the devolution of castes addressed a central recurring theme of Indo-European mythology and esoteric historiographies, and if we realize that it is precisely the material dynamics of social class and relations of production as engines of history that were the subject of Marx's analytical framework, and in the intersection between these two inverse approaches, we can excavate a hermeneutical kernel for explaining the fate of the Proto-Indo-European social structures, the dispersion of the Indo-Europeans and their path of historical development up to modernity. The fruits of such an analysis would also help illuminate both the archaic and future-oriented elements of the Indo-Europeans' experience of emergent multipolarity in our time. One of the most distinguishing traits of the Proto-Indo-European people in their time and space was their social and caste hierarchies, the patriarchal tribal social hierarchies of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, which could overtake the largely egalitarian matriarchal societies of old Europe. On the one end, are archaeologically, linguistically, mythologically, and genetically identifiable with none other than the Proto-Indo-Europeans. The reconstructed Proto-Indo-European term for village, chieftain, or tribal leader is to be compared is the compound wake or fake potus, composed firstly with the sacral term wake or vake, which means to consecrate or to set aside as sacred, from which derive Latin victima, sacrificial victim, Old Norse vija, or consecrate, Old English veo or weo, relic, sacred image, and potus, meaning male, master, or lord. Related to vake is the root reg, from which we have the major Indo-European words for king, Italic rex, Celtic rix, Sanskrit raj, etc., which might originally have referred to an official more like a priest, literally a regulator from the same root, or one who makes things right again, the same root, possibly connected with drawing correct, same root, boundaries. The fact that Rex, Reeks, and Raj, or Res, Ries, and Raj, survived only in the extremities of the Indo-European expansion in the Italo-Celtic and Indic spaces is an argument in favor of such, since Roman and Vedic societies were distinguished precisely by archaic, complex, and powerful priestly and, in general, religious institutions. The fact that such was originally a function, not always one person or caste in the strict sense, explains peculiar variations and later developments among Indo-European peoples as well. Be that as it may, Emile Benveniste's Dictionary of Indo-European Concepts in Society rigorously argues, quote, "In the most ancient world of Indo-European concepts, the king had a role which was both political and magical. He assumes complete power, ruling over the relations of men among themselves and also their relations with the gods. Because of this, he is possessed of a formidable power and consists of law and magic. The original Vake Potus, therefore, probably engaged in both consecration, that is, delineating the sacred and thereby delineating the laws of the cosmos and society, and the power, or the exercise as such, both of which functions are contained in the original sense of regulation. This means that it is not only probable, but indeed likely, that any division into sacred and temporal power in Indo-European societies was a later cleavage preceded by a ruling function which embodied or exercised both sacral and secular sovereignties. Indeed, it is curious that in the period of Proto-Indo-European formation of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and indeed even before with the Proto-Indo-Europeans' immediate archaeological predecessors, in the economic developments in the region that anticipated such, we see the archaeological records, burials, and appearance of distinguished figures who wielded decorations and instruments indicative of both functions, weaponry or props and the likes of the mace, which demonstrated coercive and regal vitality, and various ornaments made from boar, tusk, pendants, tusk caps, tusk plates, etc., which demonstrated sacrality. The latter can be seen in that the wild boar, Tworkos or Hipperos, was of cultic significance to ancient Indo-European traditions. For the Hittites, it was one of God's animals. For the Greeks, it was the warrior's animal and symbol. In Old Icelandic, Jofur, wild boar, also means prince or god. For the Germanic tribes, the wild boar was a totemic animal related to the divine brothers, the first of whom, Ebor, is a cognate for boar. For the Celts, the boar would connotate prince or priest. Hindu mythology also calls the northern ancestral lands of the Aryans the land of the boar, or Varahi. The wild boar itself was probably a sacred taboo, very much like the bear. Boar is also a euphemism. It is worth recalling that the boar was a primary figure of the faunal environment of the Indo-Europeans, ancient North Eurasian ancestors. In other words, some of the earliest distinguishing ornaments in the archaeological record of the Proto-Indo-European people were of a profound sacred significance that would be preserved in numerous Indo-European traditions, and such figured alongside, literally on the same persons, artifacts of martial, authoritative power, weapons, maces, etc. There is here then a video which looks at the wild boar in Indo-European mythology, and anyone who's interested in it will find it here on the page listed, linked here in our discussion. And this is something that I recommend taking a look at and probably shouldn't be missed. It certainly adds tremendously to this presentation, and it is there available as a link, but you can also find it here on YouTube. The socio-ideological divisions of Proto-Indo-European society have been conceptualized in Dumézil's tripartite model as originating in functions. Although the Aryan and Greek models are usually taken as the most lucid historical touchstones, linguistic and archaeological data suggest that a trifunctional system was preserved by all Indo-European peoples long after their dispersion. So in other words, these different functions existing within a single individual happened even after Indo-European groups spread into different directions. The first boar-clad and mace-wielding consecrated chiefs rose as the rulers of hunters-foragers, but this combined sovereign seems to have given way to the dual sovereign with the rise of cow-keeping. The role of the cow as the new means of production was definitive. Cows feature centrally in all Indo-European mythologies and the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European creation myth. Here is David Anthony's basic reconstruction of two essential Proto-Indo-European myths, one of creation and the origins of the priest, and the other of the cattle cycle and the origins of the warrior. Quote, "At the beginning of time, there were two brother twins, one named Man, Manu, in Proto-Indo-European, and the other, twin, Yemo. They traveled through the cosmos accompanied by a great cow. Eventually, Man and Twin decided to create the world where we now inhabit. To do this, Man had to sacrifice Twin, or in some versions, the cow, from the parts of this sacrificed body with the help of the sky gods, Sky Father, Storm God of War, divine twins. Man made the wind, the sun, the moon, the sea, earth, fire, and finally, all the various kinds of people. Man became the first priest, the creator of the ritual sacrifice that was the root of world order. After the world was made, the sky gods gave cattle to third man, Trito. But the cattle were treacherously stolen by a three-headed, six-eyed serpent. The Proto-Indo-European root for negation, Negvi, or Negfi. Third man entreated the storm god to help get the cattle back. Together, they went to the cave or mountain of the monster, killed it, or the storm god killed it alone, and freed the cattle. Trito became the first warrior. He recovered the wealth of the people, and his gift of cattle to the priests ensured that the sky gods received their share in the rising smoke of sacrificial fires. This ensured that the cycle of giving between gods and humans continued. The cow economy might explain the development of the trifunctional system. Cows were consecrated and sacrificed by the priests, defended and seized by the warrior, and raised by the herder. If before the magico-religious and martial sovereignties were embodied in one ruling person or function, then with the new range of responsibilities associated with the cattle cycle, the division of labor was given impetus as well as wealth inequality, which in turn demanded the reinforced oath, gift, and feast system characteristic of Indo-European society. Indeed, it is crucial to recognize that cattle breeding, or livestock breeding in general, especially in the 6th millennial BC, Pontic-Caspian steppe, was a complex occupation which entailed the needs for loan, feed, and animals, sacrifices to demonstrate the subordination of wealth to cosmic and socio-political loyalty, oaths for loans and contracts, the recognition of boundaries for grazing, and so on. Herders, warriors, and priests each had their fitting roles in the society of the occupation which sustained Proto-Indo-European life and became the symbol of wealth on earth and the cattle-granting divine. Here we have a very easy to look at and understand chart showing the cycle that is described above. This is the cattle cycle. And if we start from the beginning of the story, we can probably look at many different iterations that the materialist would begin with the cows are stolen by the enemy, and then the warriors recover the cows, thereby creating a relationship between the shepherds and the warriors in which the shepherds, well, of cows, the cowboys, would have to make a relationship with the warriors, who themselves were somewhat nomadic, and this relationship tied them to a system of taxation, and that a whole socio-religious framework was derived in order specifically to address this historic need as an origin story, which from the base materialist perspective would simply begin with something like someone stole the cows, dasa. The warrior class, the kshatriyas in the Hindu caste system, then recovered them, but they didn't do it for free. And they don't, in fact, give the cows back to the people, right? Not immediately. It has to go to the judge, the Brahmins. And the Brahmins would evaluate, in essence, Brahmins have a very difficult time slaying kshatriyas, but kshatriyas can get away with slaying Brahmins. And so it's questionable to what was in fact the relationship between priests and warriors. If the warriors were still people of a certain code and of a certain, thereby, moral framework in which they operated with a connection for what is right, in other words, the Reje, then we would have seen the Brahmins as the Reje. But the Reje itself could not, or the Brahmin would not have the power to enforce its rule in light of a percentage of the Kshatriya that were not ideologically or spiritually inclined and were impervious to such, and were rather individualistic or self-interested, or simply believed in the power of the sword and seizing that the force of power and the act of seizure is in fact the word of the creator to act upon the seizure, is very different from the way that the Brahmins independently from the Kshatriyas would have seen the process. But the people, Arya, are in this process in which the sacrifice, some sacrifice goes of the cows goes to the Deus, as in Zeus, or the gods or Godhead, Elohi or Elohim, Yahweh and Jehovah, and that then this creates the conditions for the planet itself, for Gaia itself, to, as a resuscitating organism, breathing and living itself, regenerating the cycle of life, and that the sacrifice creates the conditions through this metaphysical transition to complete the loop, and then it's the gods who send the cows back to earth to the people. In practical terms, Kshatriyas would ride off and scare away bandits and others who were, in raw terms, with various levels of training, and often less, but may exist in greater numbers, were a different type of warrior who were the bandit and the marauder. Now, the Kshatriyas themselves, in Marxist framework, may have developed from the same direction, but later came into a process of indoctrination or a process of finding the cult of meaning or the cult of mystery and of observance to the submission to the universe and submission to the infinite. And through the process of the submission to the infinite, to either the creation or in other iterations, the void that predates the creation, that the submission to this is the foundation of the submission of the warrior caste to the priestly caste, which was also a parallel development that happened in 7th century Arabia with the rise of Muhammad and the doctrine of Islam. And so I think that this is a very interesting process to understand in the relationship between these class systems in the ancient past, when we explore and understand the Proto-Indo-European mode of production. This is something which existed for a very long time, and instead what we have was in the 18th century the study of these elements. In the early 19th century were already divorced from the Marxist who referred to ultimately Morgan, the work of Morgan, who is cited heavily by Engels. But this is a very superficial look at the nature of property, and there's really no historical evidence to back the assertion or the belief that the rise of private property was only possible with the domestication of plants and animals, and that there was a time before that. I think that this is urban thinking. I think that even if we presuppose that man was equal to the intelligence of man today, when in fact there is some strong evidence to suggest that man in the distant past may have existed along other humanoids, but man that we refer to as the creator of the myth and the creator of legend was of a different, higher order than man in his existence today. That we can see that the entire process of creating Morgan's framework relies upon almost a Rousseauian conception, although abstracted from Rousseau's limited view of the individual in nature. We have this view of the tribe or the gens as a extended large group of families that could probably interbreed safely. So they would have existed beyond the 5th and 6th cousins to be a successful existing tribe. Now, they would have shared many physical characteristics, and those are, of course, what we now call in the extended form nations and then continentally races. But when we look at the difficulty in understanding the direction that Marxism took, they would refer to the studies of Morgan, and only later, with the development of later Marxists of the Asiatic mode of production, when we'd finally be able to look at the limitations of Marxism, how it had been defined, and how the gens was understood in relationship to the development of private property. So why I say that this is urbanism is because I believe that it would be not even a matter of generations, not even a matter of decades, and not even a matter of years, but almost instantaneously, from the passing of maybe 1 or 2 seasons to the next, that man would have understood intuitively from his existence in nature. We're talking about anatomically modern man. So we're talking about, at the very least, cognitively identical in their capacity as we today, and at least some fraction of them would have had the stroke of brilliance within a few seasons that seeds pop out of these flowers and buds and nuts, and that's what makes the trees and the wheat and so forth. So I think that it is a ludicrous idea that there was this whole prehistoric period of man in which man really didn't intuitively get that the seeds that when you stay in an area where the plants grow, and then the seeds are what are making it happen. It seems that without all these other distractions, that would have been obvious. Now one can understand that there may have been various cultures who, for different reasons, had turned the hunter-gatherer pre-landowning, pre-cultivation, pre-domestication way of life, that the hunter was following herds and not creating herds, and was probably hunting herds off into extinction and not managing an ecosystem. And this leads us back to the cattle cycle, because we can see that it was necessary for ideology to give through, as it was expressed as religion, but that it was required that there be an ideological construct which related to the cycle of limitation of slaughter. So we have in some expressions of the Proto-Indo-European religion actually the inability to eat the cow altogether. In others, it's about managing the stock, and there's been much written on this subject as well, and why this diversion in the practices of within the Indo-European proto-religion, which of course led to ultimately Hinduism, the Avestan faith, let's say Zoroastrianism, its little cousin Abrahamism, the offshoots of Zoroastrianism as well, such as Christianity in the West, when it fused, of course, with the indigenous religions of Indo-Europeans in Western Europe. But we should also bear in mind that this Proto-Indo-European religion, ideology, not only predates Christianity, but shares the characteristic with Christianity of also having been somewhat universal. And this kind of cuts against the 19th century romanticisms, which developed first in this field of one might call esoteric anthropology or romantic anthropology, which was really about creating micronation states, which could be governed by the greater powers. And so therefore some of the conspirology around the development of some nationalisms as having been the result of conspiratorial orders, or for example, primitive NGOs, if you will, or medieval NGOs of that time of early and pre-modernity, and then also in early modernity and in the 19th century, that these are fairly justified accusations, or fairly justified ways of problematizing it. But we can see here inherently there's an ecosystem at work, and it was a revolution in man, and a revolution in man's experience, that religion developed this way. It didn't happen by accident. My point here is that while there would have been some groups that would have made a religion out of the wrong practice, in the same way that the ruling class and its priests today of modernity have also followed the wrong practice. So this is what is prescriptive about today's instruction and today's message, is that the ideology of the ruling class is not merely a reflection of the mode of production, but ultimately can also be determinative of it. And this turns the determinism of Marx as based upon a sort of blind and unguided development, the invisible hand, if you will, of Marx's historical materialism, is that technologies simply develop evenly, unpredictably, following some path of normal and undirected scientific research, when in fact things are researched, there's tremendous effort that goes into acquiring funding for research. There's tremendous lobbying. It is a decision, it is a civilizational decision that is made to invest heavy research into major scientific projects, and then you have to justify those. And then what you think is worthy of a major scientific investigation and project is based upon the paradigm and the framework from which you're operating in. So there arises many contradictions in understanding, and from which some very serious criticisms upon the old, or let's say orthodox Marxist conception of Marxism presents, but that we can actually utilize the tools and methodologies presented within Marxism and to actually understand and come to terms with and assess from an interdisciplinary perspective, bringing in a divergent school of understanding early European man, which is at odds with the direction that Marxism went, even in its early days. So I think that from this point we will continue. This is also a video I recommend called Sacred Aryan Cow. Have a look at it. J. Arnold continues, thus from the standpoint of an analysis of the material relations of production through the rising division of labor in the cattle cycle among priestly, martial, and productive functions, we can preliminarily summarily argue that it is out of the cattle economy that began the division of sovereignties. In fact, Engels argued that livestock breeding is one of the central developments in the transformation of primitive societies into increasingly commodified societies with the potential for the emergence of classes. We have, quote, it was apparently the domestication and breeding of animals and the formation of herds of considerable size that led to the differentiation of the Aryans. The European and Asiatic Aryans still have the same names for cattle. The wild buffalo cow had to be hunted. The tame buffalo cow gave a calf yearly and milk as well. A number of the most advanced tribes, the Aryans, Semites, perhaps already also the Turanians, now made their chief work the first taming of cattle, later their breeding and tending only. Pastoral tribes separated themselves from the mass of the rest of the barbarians, the first great social division of labor. The pastoral tribes produced not only more necessities of life than the other barbarians, but different ones. They possessed the advantage over them of not only milk products, and greater supplies of meat, but also skins, wool, goat hair, and spun and woven fabrics, which became more common as the amount of raw material increased. Thus, for the first time, regular exchange became possible. At the early stages, only occasional exchanges can take place. Particular skill in the making of weapons and tools may lead to a temporary division of labor. Thus, in many places, undoubted remains of workshops for the making of stone tools have been found, dating from the later Stone Age. The artists who here perfected their skill probably worked for the whole community, as each special handcraftsman still does in the Gentile communities in India. In no case should exchange arise at this stage except within the tribe itself, and then only as an exceptional event. But now, with the differentiation of pastoral tribes, we find all the conditions right for exchanging between branches of different tribes and its development into a regular established institution. Originally, tribes exchanged with tribe through the respective chiefs of the gens. But the herds began to pass through into private ownership. Exchange between individuals became more common, and finally, the only form. Now the chief article which the pastoral tribes exchanged with their neighbors was cattle. Cattle became the commodity by which all other commodities were valued, and which was everywhere willingly taken in exchange from them. In short, cattle acquired a money function, and already at this stage did the work of money. With such necessity and speed, even at the very beginning of commodity exchange, did the need for a money commodity develop. Anthony summates that it is precisely the socio-economic and religious norms accompanying the cattle economy that became, quote, the foundation of Indo-European religion and society. Both archaeologically and linguistically, it is the domestication and herding of cattle that would thereby separate the Indo-European people from other tribes in the area, ultimately making Proto-Indo-European the language of the cattle elites. The mobile wealth of the cattle can be seen as the economic base for the superstructure of both the development of the Indo-European functions and later castes and classes, a nature which is reflected in mythology and most famously concentrated in the Germanic rune Fehu, which not coincidentally has highly significant esoteric or cosmomythological interpretations. Overall, it is thus clear that assessing the normative means and mode of production of Proto-Indo-European society as it took shape in the cattle economy is a coherent and crucial key to understanding the development of Indo-European caste functions and their mythological narratives. If the cow gave birth to the Proto-Indo-Europeans, figuratively in their myth and literally in their socioeconomic formation, then the horse is what ultimately made them uniquely Indo-Europeans, gave impetus to the evolution of the martial function, and drove their expansion and migrations, from the contours of which we derive the name of this culture stretching from Europe to India. The Proto-Indo-Europeans were the first known people to domesticate and then tame the horse, an animal which would be just as impactfully enshrined in Indo-European mythology as it was transformative to the already existing Proto-Indo-European mode of production and socioeconomic structure. If the cow impacted the further division of labor and functions in Proto-Indo-European society, then horse riding subsequently advanced by the introduction of wheeled vehicles in the steppes, as in chariots, by 3300 BC, had enormous implications to Proto-Indo-European society, all the way up to and including the dispersion of the Indo-European peoples. The horse yielded the chariot-riding Indo-European warrior that would be immortalized in Indo-European mythology and who would finally migrate out of the steppes to the point that the original Proto-Indo-European language would be dead by 2500 BC, its daughters having ridden their horses and chariots out onto what would soon become historical peoples, their original steppe homeland becoming the site of intercontinental travel, trade, and conquest for millennia, eventually being absorbed as an integral part of the Russian-Eurasian space. Therefore, in order to delve further into the material, historical trajectory of the Indo-European peoples from their primordial steppe societies all the way up to our archaeo-futuristic multipolar threshold, we must turn to try to grasp the significance of the horse to the Indo-Europeans, reflected in their archaeology, mythology, language, and functional traditions. It might just be the quest to understand the full profundity of the revolution of the Indo-European horse and the discourses and methodologies needed to do so that will reconcile Karl Marx and Julius Evola. This has been a reading and a discussion of J.F. Arnold's from his series, The Multipolar Revolution, Syncretic Perspectives, Part 3, Marx and the Indo-European Mode of Production. Thank you for listening today, and this has been a very good session. I'm glad that we dug into this piece. And I want to welcome you all to check the piece out. We have listed it here. It is here in the group Syncretic Studies. I will be reposting it again as a top piece, and I will add to this as well, if it is not already here, the link to the article in its original. And this is one I think that requires a study. It elucidates a number of subjects, and it leads to, I think, a more clear understanding of the subject at hand. Thank you, and have a great rest of the afternoon. And don't forget to help our Patreon grow as we are working on this and developing the center. And all proceeds go to our nonprofit NGO, which entirely fund and make possible these projects and others. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day.